They say humiliation doesn't always feel like fire. Sometimes it feels like silence. Like the room is holding its breath while everyone waits to see what you will do. That was the feeling the day my boss stood in front of the entire dev team, waved a hand at my code contributions on the screen, and casually laughed. "This is, well, boomer tech," he said. A few people chuckled. Not because they agreed, but because they were afraid not to. I just sat there, my jaw still, my expression calm, but something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Just a kind of quiet clarity. The kind that comes when you realize you've been underestimating yourself for far too long. I had been the senior systems engineer at that company for 6 years. I built half of the back-end infrastructure they still used. I architected the internal data security guidelines. I mentored new hires, fixed the things others created, and kept the place stable through at least 7 product pivots my boss called visionary direction. The truth is, he was good at pitching ideas, good at selling dreams, and terrible at the parts that required discipline, documentation, and patience. That was my role. Or rather, that had been my role. Until the new investors came in, and suddenly, everything had to look young, fresh, innovative, flashier. And I was apparently the relic. A week after the meeting, he called me into his office to show me something. His voice was proud, like a kid showing off a drawing. "We're rewriting the entire back end in my new architecture," he said. "The one I designed. No more old school patterns. No more slow processes." I looked at the whiteboard. It was unstable. Dependencies layered wrong. Data handling unsafe. Security non-existent. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. He smiled wider. "You'll help finalize the launch. Be a team player." That was when I smiled. Just a small one. He mistook it for agreement. The thing he didn't know was that 3 years earlier, I had quietly filed patents related to the system architecture I designed. The data flow structures. The concurrency models. The network safety fallback systems. I filed them under my own name, as independent research, and later licensed them to the company for use. He had never read the contract. He had never noticed the expiration date. It expired last quarter. Which meant the moment they replaced my code with their new system, every part of their backend that still used my patented structures, and I promise you, there were many, became a legal infringement the moment I revoked the license. And to revoke it, I needed one email. A single, quiet email. Launch day came. Investors in the conference room. Clients in video calls. My boss stood at the head of the room, giving a speech about innovation and modernization. He clicked the demo button. And nothing happened. Then the alarms triggered. Processes crashed. Access was blocked. The system didn't break. It simply stopped allowing them to use it. Just as designed. Everyone stared. Everyone panicked. He looked at me like I had set the building on fire. I simply handed him a printed document. The patent revocation notice. The licensing terms. His signature on the original contract. The expiration date highlighted in yellow. And the reminder that I had been the one stabilizing his decisions all these years. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. For once, he had no pitch, no speech, no spin. I didn't threaten. I didn't insult. I didn't gloat. I simply offered them a new licensing agreement. One that required either my reinstatement as lead architect with full decision authority and compensation adjustment, or full system rebuild from zero, which would take them at least 13 months and millions of dollars they did not have. The room stayed silent for a long time. They rehired me the same afternoon. My boss didn't return Monday. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's not even satisfying. It's just a quiet rebalancing of weight. A reminder of who built what. A reminder that respect isn't owed because of a title, but because of the work, the discipline, the patience, and the hours poured into making something real while other people chased applause. I didn't want to destroy him. I just wanted him to understand who he was talking to. And now he does. The office felt different the next day. Not louder. Not triumphant. Just quiet. People moved carefully, not in fear, but in thought. They had seen something they didn't know how to process. The person they quietly assumed was just keeping things running had been the one holding the foundation together the entire time. Respect doesn't always arrive as applause. Sometimes it arrives in silence. A space carved out where people suddenly look at you differently, not because you changed, but because they finally saw what was always there. I didn't make any grand announcements. I didn't redecorate the office or erase my boss's name from documents. I sat at my desk like I always had. I opened my laptop. I began working. The only difference was the room seemed to steady around me, like the building itself exhaled. Some of the younger devs hesitated before approaching me. One finally did. He didn't apologize for laughing in that meeting. He didn't explain himself. He just said, quietly, "I didn't know." And I nodded. Because he was right. He didn't. And sometimes that's enough. The investors reached out personally later that week. Their tone was different too. Not panicked anymore, curious. They wanted to understand how the system worked, why it worked, and what had nearly destroyed it. I walked them through everything. Slowly. Patiently. Not to prove I was necessary, but to show that the system had never been a fluke. It had been built piece by piece, with intention and foresight. And they listened now. Really listened. Because they understood the cost of not doing so. My former boss sent an email. A short one. No insults. No excuses. Just a single sentence. "I didn't realize how much I depended on you." I didn't reply. Not out of spite. Just because there was nothing left to say. Some lessons don't need conversations. They need time. And truth. Replacing him didn't solve everything. Leadership is not a chair you sit in. It's a weight you learn how to carry. There were still broken processes to unwind, morale to rebuild, trust to restore. But I didn't rush any of it. I didn't try to erase the past to pretend it didn't happen. I simply started moving forward, slowly and steadily. Because architecture, whether of systems or of people, is never about speed. It's about stability. Consistency. Pressure applied at the right points, not all points. Weeks passed, and the office gradually settled into a new kind of rhythm. One that wasn't built on fear of being replaced or mocked. People began asking questions again, offering ideas, experimenting. Code reviews turned into conversations instead of critiques. Meetings became quieter and shorter. Not because people were afraid, but because trust changes the volume of everything. One night, I stayed late, walking the same halls I'd walked for years. But something felt different. I no longer felt like I was defending my right to be there. I didn't feel like I was trying to prove anything. I was simply part of the place I had helped build. A quiet presence threaded through architecture, logic, decision chains. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just foundational. And foundations don't need applause. They just need to hold. There came a moment, maybe a month after the dust had settled, when I found myself sitting alone in the break room, late in the evening. The building was quiet. The lights were dim. The kind of silence that invites you to think, not because you want to, but because the day has finally stopped pushing you forward. I sat there with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold and realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not at him. Not at the team. Not at the situation. The humiliation I felt that day didn't burn now. It simply existed as a reminder of where the line had been crossed, and how far I had grown past it. Revenge, I learned, is not the fire people imagine. It's not about destroying someone or proving them wrong in front of a crowd. Real revenge is quiet. It's the calm decision to continue being yourself after someone tried to redefine you. It's the moment you stop needing validation. It's when you don't rush to explain your value, because your work already does that for you. What I did wasn't about power. It wasn't about getting even. It wasn't even about winning. It was simply about correcting the balance. Restoring something that had been bent out of shape. The younger developers eventually stopped looking at me like a cautionary tale and started looking at me the way my mentor once looked at me, someone they could learn from. I didn't try to lecture them about respect or longevity or discipline. I showed them through patience. Through quiet, steady work. Through asking the kind of questions that made them think instead of defend. And slowly, they changed too. Not into versions of me, but into people who carried themselves with more care, more thought, more awareness of how easy it is to break something, and how much skill it takes to build something that lasts. One evening, one of them asked me, "Do you ever regret staying?" I thought about it for a long time before answering. Because regret is complicated. Because leaving would have been easy, clean, satisfying. But sometimes leaving means letting someone rewrite your story for you. So I told him the truth. No. I don't regret staying. I regret ever thinking I needed someone's permission to take ownership of what I built. He nodded, not fully understanding yet. But one day he will. Because the world will always have people who mistake volume for intelligence. The world will always have leaders who believe ideas matter more than the systems that hold them. The world will always have someone who tries to undermine what they cannot replicate. But none of that changes reality. Systems don't lie. Architecture doesn't lie. Results don't lie. Only people do. And eventually, the truth stands on its own. So I continue working. Quietly. Deliberately. Not to prove anything. Not to defend my past. Just to build. Because building is what lasts. And because the strongest things in this world are not loud. They are precise. They are patient. They are consistent. Just like good code. Time has a way of revealing character. As the months passed, the office changed in small but noticeable ways. The CTO, the one who liked to call everything boomer tech, continued pushing loud ideas and buzzwords, chasing attention instead of substance. At first, the executives were dazzled by his confidence, the kind of confidence that fills rooms before meaning arrives. But confidence without foundation is just air in a balloon, and sooner or later, it stretches too thin. Deadlines slipped. Server costs spiked. Client complaints stopped being occasional and became routine. The system he insisted on replacing mine with began to fail under real load, not because the developers were inexperienced, but because it had been built like a toy pretending to be a machine. Meanwhile, the foundation I designed, sturdy, boring, invisible, held up the parts of the company still functioning. I didn't point it out. I didn't highlight the contrast. I didn't say I told you so. I simply continued improving what I knew needed to last. And slowly, the people who once looked past me began to understand something they had never bothered to see. Quiet work is the architecture of stability. Loud work is just decoration. The investors eventually noticed the difference too. They are not emotional people. They are not concerned with pride or ego or office politics. They look only at outcomes. And outcomes were becoming very clear. Meetings that used to involve presentations and slogans now involved questions that required real answers. Why did the system fail under scale? Why did this optimization regress? Why is someone with less experience undoing stable infrastructure? The CTO had answers, of course. He always had answers. But answers are not the same as competence. I didn't need to expose him. The truth did that on its own. One afternoon, I was called into a conference room. I walked in expecting trouble. Maybe blame. Maybe politics. Maybe another round of subtle disrespect disguised as feedback. Instead, the lead investor spoke directly. Calm voice. Simple question. We would like you to take over the software direction of the company. Quietly. No announcements. Just fix what matters. There was no dramatic pause. No triumphant music. Just a room that finally saw what it had been standing on all along. I accepted, not because I needed the position, but because I finally understood something I had missed when I was younger. Respect is not something you demand, argue for, or chase. Respect is something others arrive at on their own, often slowly, sometimes painfully, when the noise around them eventually falls away. As for the CTO, he didn't get fired. But he did get something much heavier, responsibility he could no longer hide behind. And responsibility has a weight that exposes everything. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel victorious. I simply went back to work. Because building is what I do. Because systems are honest in a way people rarely are. Because there is a kind of peace in knowing that the world eventually aligns with reality, even if it takes longer than it should. And because real revenge isn't the moment they fall. Real revenge is the moment you no longer need to watch. There came a morning when I arrived earlier than usual. The office was still dark, the kind of dark where the monitors glow faintly even before they're switched on. I sat at my desk, listening to the hum of the servers in the background, a steady, low vibration that had become a familiar presence over the years. It reminded me of something I learned long ago: things that are strong rarely make noise. Buildings don't announce their weight. Bridges don't brag about their load. Foundations simply hold. And maybe that's all I ever wanted, to build something that holds. As the sun began to fill the office windows, people trickled in. Some nodded at me, some didn't. But there was a different atmosphere now, something subtle, something that didn't need to be spoken. The younger developers didn't look at me like a leftover from a past era anymore. They watched the way I approached problems. They listened to how I broke down complexity. Not eager. Not afraid. Just aware that there was something they could learn if they paid attention. They started coming to me before making big decisions, not because they needed approval, but because they finally understood that wisdom and experience aren't limitations. They're accelerators. The CTO avoided me now. Not dramatically. Not defensively. Just quietly. The way someone avoids a mirror when they're not ready to look at themselves. His voice in meetings became more careful. His suggestions less theatrical. He didn't insult architecture principles anymore. He didn't joke about old school thinking. He didn't call anything boomer tech these days. Because he finally understood something he had ignored for far too long: you cannot replace understanding with confidence. You cannot out-talk reality. But here's what surprised me most. I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't feel satisfaction when deadlines broke under his decisions. I didn't feel triumph when investors questioned him. I didn't feel vindicated when the truth revealed itself. I only felt calm. Because when someone doesn't know what they don't know, the world eventually teaches them. And the world is a patient teacher. One evening, he approached me. Not with arrogance. Not with excuses. Just quietly. He stood beside my desk for a moment before speaking. "I know I was harsh before," he said. Not apologizing. Not fully acknowledging. Just reaching for something he didn't know how to express. I nodded. Not to forgive him, not to comfort him, but to acknowledge that he was trying. And sometimes, that is enough. "I didn't understand what your work really was," he continued. "It just looked old. Stable. Slow. I didn't see the depth in it." This time, I spoke. Calm. Simple. "You were looking at the surface. Systems are like people. You don't understand them by glancing at them. You understand them by living with them long enough to see what holds when things get difficult." He didn't respond. But he understood. We didn't become friends. We didn't need to. Some stories don't end with reconciliation. Some end with recognition. And recognition is enough. Because in the end, the real victory wasn't replacing him. Or proving him wrong. Or earning a new title. The real victory was this: I never changed who I was. I stayed steady. I kept building. I trusted the work to speak. And the work did. It always does. Months passed, and life at the company settled into a rhythm that felt different from the one before. The chaos was still there, because chaos always exists somewhere in the machinery of any living system, but it no longer felt personal. It no longer felt like a storm someone else was creating just to prove themselves. It was just work now, the kind of work that challenges you without disrespecting you. The kind of work that allows you to grow without being forced to defend your right to be there. The younger developers began to trust themselves more, not because they became fearless, but because they finally understood that fear is not the enemy. Acting without understanding is. They made mistakes, but they owned them. They built things slowly and carefully. They learned how to pause, how to think, how to test assumptions before turning them into code. And when they got stuck, when the problem was something deeper than syntax or architecture, they came to me, not for answers, but for perspective. We would sit at the whiteboard together, sometimes in silence for long stretches, just looking at the shape of the problem. Not rushing. Not forcing. Just letting understanding arrive when it was ready. And when it did, when the pieces clicked into place, we didn't celebrate loudly. We didn't cheer. We just nodded, because clarity doesn't need applause. The CTO changed too. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Small things. He listened more. He asked questions with the intention to understand, not to challenge. He slowed down. He stopped interrupting. And I could see in his eyes something that I recognized from my younger years. The realization that talent and potential mean nothing without humility. One afternoon, during a system review, he paused mid-sentence. He looked at a section of the architecture and asked, softly, almost to himself, "Why didn't I see this before?" I could have answered with something sharp. Something clever. Something satisfying. But maturity is knowing which victories are hollow. So I simply said, "You saw it. You just didn't understand what you were seeing yet." He nodded. And that was the moment he finally understood the difference between novelty and depth. He didn't thank me. He didn't apologize. He didn't need to. The real apology was in the learning. Over time, the company stabilized. Clients returned. Systems held. The panic dissolved into routine. The noise faded. And one day, I realized something that made me unexpectedly still inside. No one was calling my work boomer tech anymore. Not because the culture shifted overnight. Not because someone defended me. Not because I won an argument, but because the code kept running. Through scale. Through failure. Through pressure. Through time. And time is the most honest judge of all things. One evening, as I shut down my workstation, I looked at the empty office around me, the quiet glow of screens, the smell of old coffee, the muted hum of servers, and I understood something very clearly. I didn't stay to be valued. I didn't stay to prove anything. I stayed to finish the work. Because real builders aren't motivated by recognition. We are motivated by the architecture of what remains standing after everything else has fallen. And sometimes, that is enough. One day, the company hosted a small gathering. Not a celebration, not a corporate announcement, just an informal evening where people could breathe a little after the long months of recovery. There was soft music playing from a speaker someone had left on a shelf. People stood in small groups, talking quietly, the way people do when the struggle is still recent and the relief is gentle rather than loud. I stood near the window with a cup of coffee, watching the city lights outside. The patterns of traffic, the blinking signs, the quiet movement of thousands of people who would never know the story unfolding in this office. That thought always humbled me. Stories that feel enormous while living them eventually become quiet memories in rooms like this. The CTO walked over. Not confidently. Not timidly. Just human. He stood beside me without speaking for a while. I didn't mind. Silence has never been an enemy for me. Some people fill silence because they're afraid of what it reveals. Others sit in it because they finally trust what it holds. After a moment, he spoke. I used to think speed was everything, he said. Move fast. Impress fast. Outperform fast. He laughed once under his breath. I didn't understand that stability is a speed of its own. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. He continued, when I called your code boomer tech, I wasn't mocking the code. I was mocking what I didn't understand. I saw something I couldn't replicate, so I tried to make it small. So I could feel big. He looked at the floor, not in shame, but in acknowledgement. That was insecurity. Not conviction. People think apologies are about saying I'm sorry. But real apologies sound like this, someone finally telling the truth about themselves. I nodded once, slowly. We all learn differently, I said. What matters is that we learn. He let out a quiet breath. Not relief. Just release. We talked a little more that night. Not about the past, not about what happened, not about blame or credit. We talked about architecture. About the beauty of systems that outlast their creators. About designing things that hold up under failure. About how code, when written with patience, becomes less like instructions and more like structure. Something that breathes. Something that supports. Something that endures. He wasn't the same person he had been when this began. And I wasn't either. Growth doesn't require forgiveness. It requires distance from who we once were. When the gathering ended and people began to leave, I took one last look around the office. It didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It didn't feel like a proving ground. It didn't feel like a place where I had to guard myself or minimize parts of who I was. It simply felt like a workplace. A place to build. A place to think. A place to leave something standing. That is the quiet conclusion of many stories like this. Not triumph. Not defeat. Not revenge in the dramatic sense. Just restoration. Because sometimes the strongest ending is not the one where someone falls. It's the one where everyone finally stands on level ground. Life after that didn't suddenly become perfect. Work was still work. Problems still came. Deadlines still tightened. Systems still needed to be maintained, improved, redesigned piece by piece. But there was a difference now. The ground felt even. The air felt clearer. The conversations were about the work again, not about ego, not about proving who belonged and who didn't. The pressure didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt like the weight of responsibility, the kind that builds muscle instead of creating bruises. The younger developers began to grow in ways I recognized. Not because they were becoming like me, but because they were learning how to stand on their own foundations. They were no longer chasing clever solutions just to be impressive. They were designing systems with patience. They were thinking in years instead of days. One of them rewrote a part of the pipeline I had designed years ago, and he did it better than I had. Not by replacing it with something new for the sake of novelty, but by understanding it deeply enough to extend it. That moment mattered to me more than any promotion I've ever received. Because when your work becomes a foundation others can build on, that is legacy in its purest, quietest form. Around this time, I started mentoring a new engineer who had just joined the company. He was bright, enthusiastic, and impatient in the way gifted people often are. He reminded me of the CTO, actually, not in arrogance, but in the restless need to prove something. He stayed late most nights, chasing elegant solutions to problems that didn't need elegance. One evening, he sighed and said, "Why is your code always so simple? It's like it hides something." I smiled, not at him, but at the memory of who I used to be. I told him, simple code is only simple after you understand the problem fully. Complexity is what we write when we don't know enough yet. Simplicity is what remains once we do. He didn't understand then. But he will. People don't grow in moments of applause. They grow in quiet rooms, failing in small ways, adjusting, learning to think instead of react. As for the CTO, we never became close. We didn't need to. Our relationship became something more useful, functional respect. When disagreements came, and they did, they were no longer battles. They were discussions. He didn't treat my experience as a threat anymore. I didn't treat his ambition as recklessness. He asked questions before making decisions. I listened to his ideas without dismissing them. We were no longer opponents in the same room. We were professionals working in the same direction. And that is a quiet, meaningful victory. One evening, as I was packing up to leave, he stopped by my desk and said, "You know, I didn't just learn architecture from you. I learned how to stay when something is difficult." I looked at him, and for the first time since all of this began, I saw him clearly. Not as the person who once undermined me. Not as the person who tried to shrink what he could not understand. But as someone who had grown. And in that moment, I realized something important: people don't stay the same. Even the ones who hurt us. Even us. We don't end up who we were. We end up who we choose to become after the hard parts are over. So I nodded once, slowly, and said, "Then I think we both learned what we needed to." Then I turned off the lights. And I went home. Time moved the way time always does, quietly, steadily, without asking permission. The office changed again, not with sudden announcements or dramatic reorganizations, but through small decisions stacking on top of each other like bricks in a wall. Someone cleaned up the build pipeline. Someone rewrote old documentation so it made sense again. Someone proposed a mentorship rotation so no new developer ever felt like they were learning alone. None of these changes were attributed to any single person. They didn't need to be. When culture shifts, it isn't because one person shouts loud enough. It's because enough people start choosing to see differently. The CTO eventually stopped calling himself a visionary. He stopped selling futures he hadn't built yet. He started attending architecture reviews not as a performer, but as a student. Sometimes he still moved too fast. Sometimes he still wanted to leap instead of climb. But this time, when someone slowed him down, he listened. That alone told me the story had changed. One afternoon, while reviewing some legacy modules, I found a comment in the code, one I had written years ago when I was tired, stretched thin, trying to hold the system together without letting anyone see how heavy it had become. It read, "If someone ever has time, this should be rebuilt properly." I remembered the version of myself who wrote that. Tired. Underestimated. Trying not to drown. I called over the new engineer I had been mentoring. He read the comment. He smiled. Then he began rewriting it the right way, not to impress, not to prove anything, but because he finally understood why foundations matter. He didn't ask me how to do it. He only asked, "Does this feel like the direction you had in mind?" I didn't answer immediately. I didn't need to. The work spoke. "Yes," I said. Exactly like that. And I felt something I hadn't expected, peace. Not triumph. Not relief. Not revenge completed. Just peace. Because the best kind of revenge is when the world corrects itself, and you no longer feel the need to hold the wheel. A few weeks later, the CTO passed by my desk. He wasn't looking for advice this time. He wasn't making amends. He wasn't circling around a question he didn't know how to phrase. He was holding a cup of coffee, leaning casually against the side of my desk, as though we had worked together like this all our lives. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think legacy code meant outdated code." I looked at him. "And now?" I asked. He ran his thumb along the rim of his coffee cup, thinking for a long moment before replying. "Now I think legacy code is what stays standing after ego has fallen." I didn't smile. But something inside me settled. We didn't talk more after that. We didn't need to. I packed up my things at the end of the day, same desk, same chair, same office, but everything felt different. Not because they changed who I was, but because I didn't let them. And maybe that's what real revenge is. Not forcing someone to see your value, but living in a way that makes it impossible for them to ignore it anymore. In the end, there was no applause, no dramatic moment, no spotlight waiting to prove I had been right all along. The world rarely works that way. Things didn't resolve with a speech or a victory pose or some grand acknowledgement of everything I endured. Instead, the ending arrived the same way the change did, gradually, quietly, like a room filling with morning light. The company moved forward, steadier than before, built now on understanding instead of insecurity. The younger engineers grew confident not by shouting, but by learning. The CTO learned to lead not by being loud, but by listening. And I stayed, not out of need, bitterness, or pride, but because the work still mattered. The system still mattered. The craft still mattered. I didn't need recognition. I didn't need vindication. I didn't need anyone to rewrite what had already happened. What mattered was who I became in the process, someone who didn't break when disrespected, who didn't shrink when underestimated, who didn't abandon the foundation just because others failed to see it. Real revenge was never about making someone fall. It was about standing so steadily that no one could move me again. And in that quiet, uncelebrated victory, I learned the simplest truth that all builders eventually come to understand: the strongest things in this world do not shout, they remain.